We're going to make this work. All right, we are going, and welcome everybody to the 2021 debut of the Popular Music Books in Process series. I want to start by thanking my co-organizers, Kimberly Mack and Carl Wilson. Carl will handle the Q&A at the end, which we encourage everyone to participate in vociferously throughout the festivities. We're a collaboration, our series is, between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, which hosts our website that lists the full schedule for the series under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, and the POP Conference, which now has a new host institution, the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music. So all of those folks have helped make this possible, and we thank them all. If you'd like to see back editions of our series, the first 24 or so are all on my YouTube page, and we've got about another 27 weeks slated between now and July, all sorts of goodies. So check out the schedule on the IASPM US site. All right. Want to hugely welcome our keynote speaker for today. A POP conference, I would say not just regular, but pretty much inventor, going back to, gosh only knows, maybe fall 2001, Princeton University, Kurt Cobain died for somebody's sins, but not mine, talks. And Lord knows how many twists and turns in the wind ever since. Daphne A. Brooks, who has written a fantastic new book coming out in February, Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. And she'll be talking about it today, joined by Farah, Jasmine, Griffin, and Gayle Wald. So I'll really quickly run through their bios. Daphne is the author of 3 books, Bodies in Dissent, Jeff Buckley's Grace, and now Liner Notes for the Revolution. She is working on Black Feminist book number 2, a reading of Porgy and Bess. And all of this, I think, is part of a multi-volume study, Subterranean Blues, Black Women's Sound Modernity. And you have read her by now in the New York Times, The Nation, LA Review of Books, and for someone who cites liner notes in such fine liner notes as, for example, Prince.
Farah's on now.
Woo, Farah. Oh, good. Farah, welcome. I was just vamping till you were ready. Speaking of which, our newest member in this cohort, Farah Jasmine Griffin, is William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies and Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies. Author of many books, including If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, Who Set You Flowing, co-author Clawing at the Limits of Cool, Daphne, what's the name of Farah's newest book that you mentioned in the...
Let Farah tell it.
Farah, what's the name of your newest book?
The title's too long, but the first part is Read Until You Understand. I'll let that just stay
Awesome. There. Welcome. Sorry for the hassle getting in. And finally, another POP conference co-conspirator, co-inventor, Gayle Wald, former chair of American Studies at George Washington, still teaches there though, author of Sister Rosetta Tharpe book, Soul book, and working now on a book about Ella Jenkins. And Lord knows this is a fantastic panel and I should now shut up and let them get to it. Daphne, Gayle, Farah, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm going to immediately share a screen if I can. Not that, but this. And thank you all again for being here. You know, when you have a mass memorial that's on at the same time that you're doing this, it really puts things in perspective. You can't see anybody, but as long as you all can see me and you can see the screen, fair enough. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's good. It works.
Right on. So my abundant thanks to the organizers of the Popular Music Books in Process series, Kimberly Mack, Carl Wilson, and my longtime friend and colleague, Eric Weisbard, who, along with the equally great and majestic Ann Powers, launched an annual conference 20 years ago, this upcoming spring, that has, I think, right, that has galvanized, or close to it, galvanized, sustained, expanded, and in many ways powerfully transformed public and academic writing about popular music culture. Kudos, my friend, and thank you to Kim and Carl for co-steering this ship through these troubled times. And thank you again to everyone for logging on. Over in these parts, forgive me, but we are actually weathering an alarming pet emergency with our dear dog Gibson, mascot of this book I wrote. He is hospitalized for the night, and I'm sorry to say his prognosis is possibly quite dire. So I'm not above begging for your prayers for our pooch. And now, how lucky am I to have, or to be in virtual company with me, right? Two of the OGs of Black feminist sound and popular music studies, two genius thinkers and writers who revolutionized the field of writing about music in their own respective ways by producing work which, among other things, has taught us how to expand the critical lexicon of artist biographies about path-breaking Black women musicians, how to write with beauty and lyricism and dazzling ethical care about the aesthetic labor of Black musicians and culture makers, radical innovators, aesthetics of sound who documented and articulated our most intimate sorrows, as well as the profundity of our tenacious dreams. Thank you so, so much, Farah, Jasmine, Griffin, and Gayle Wald, for gathering around the Zoom table with me and returning to a conversation that we've been having for many, many years now with one another. When I convened a Black feminist sound studies faculty workshop at Princeton University back in, I want to say early 2013, I was interested in naming a transgenerational phenomenon in popular music studies, one in which, for at that point, more than a decade's worth of new and pivotal scholarly work on the centrality, the badassery, if you will, the break all the rules, singular contributions of Black women musicians across the 20th and 21st centuries was clearly upending the norms that dictated who was deemed worthy of our attention in popular music culture, as well as how we wrote about the dimensions of worth in popular music culture. That little gathering over the course of one weekend, which I had hoped to replicate regularly, by the way, didn't happen since I left that institution the following year. But that little gathering was a deeply moving affair. And very famously, as our seminar came to a close, Farah, Jasmine, Griffin asked this of me, asked this of my then Stellamorphous project, I should say. Are you just trying to write a big book? I hope she's laughing, I can't see her. It was hilarious. And big sister, get your act together, tough love questioning. And it was absolutely invaluable to me because it pushed me to try and answer what would arguably seem to be a simple question, but is anything but. And the question is this: if you were to point to a moment that marks the advent, the beginning of contemporary popular music culture, where would it be? Old schoolers have long told us here, or here. And certainly our revisionist historians have reminded us to look here and even here. But what happens if we tell the story of popular music culture as we come to know and feel and experience it today by instead starting here with the catastrophe of 1619? And still more, what if we were to center the ideas and feelings, the observations and desires of the sisters who were the descendants of those in the hold, out in the field, confined to the kitchen? What if we actively kept that history front and center in our readings. Black women's musicianship across the centuries. If we took into account that history in relation to Black women's musicianship and across the centuries, and if we took into account the socioeconomic, material, and psychic conditions that undergird Black women's artistry, what would that tale sound like? How would that affect the nature of what we valued about their music, how we narrated their worth, how we interpreted the work of the music itself as an archive of historical memory, an archive of our affective relationship with historical memory, and as a multifaceted mode of both social critique and social intimacy. These were questions I had. So despite my resistance to Farah's questioning, no, I'm not trying to write a big book. I'm just trying to change the tenor of the conversations we have about Black women's musicianship. The thing that I was ultimately after was shaped by centuries of violence, systemic inequities, the enormity of chronic loss and marginalization, and how our writing about popular music culture might do a better job of capturing all of that. But I was determined to tell a story that was not just about all of the dudes, young and old, sharing the news, many of whom are on this call, and I call them my friends and mentors, my collaborators and interlocutors, my critical sparring partners and debaters, but one that was equally about the nearly wholly overlooked history of Black women culture makers, performers and writers, activists, critics, and even family members, as well as the allies, who for well over a century now have been making their own meaning, producing knowledge about and documenting their own desires for and intimacies with the music and cultural forms that mattered to them. So at its core, Liner Notes for the Revolution is the story of why and how Black women musicians across the 20th and 21st centuries have been and remain essential architects of popular music culture. It's a book about why these artists, from blues queens like Bessie to superstar icons like Yance, fundamentally matter in the making of our modern world and how we navigate that world. It views them as artistic pathbreakers and innovators, as repositories of cultural memory, as bearers of complex and profound emotions, and of course, as activist voices of vision and social change in the long Black freedom struggle. It also explores the reasons why these artists are both so passionately beloved and so often critically marginalized, disappeared from the historical record, or oversimplified with regards to their enormous cultural value and worth. So it's a book that that's as much about criticism and record collecting and the men who've dominated these worlds as it is about the women and the girls, the artists and the critics and the fans who valued Black women's music when others wouldn't. But throughout, I try to hold on to this truth, that the sisters are the stars of this show. Women like Pauline Hopkins, arguably the first Black feminist cultural critic in my book, Zora Neale Hurston in her guise as a sound ethnographer and performer, playwright Lorraine Hansberry in her guise as a queer Black feminist critic of modern culture, Janelle Monáe is an innovator of the liner note form. And in the latter portion of the book, I turn my attention to the experimental performances and recordings of contemporary artists like Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, Valerie June, and Rhiannon Giddens, who amount to, in my opinion, some of our boldest public historians. So at its heart, this is a book then that aims to celebrate and take seriously the radical intellectual culture of Black women's music. And that's my little show and tell here. And apologies for its raggedness a little bit, since again, I'm dealing with a dog emergency. But I'm so delighted to be able to talk with Gayle and Farah, my two fairy god big sisters, as I like to call them. So let's do this.
Okay.
Questions?
I just want to say, Daphne, that the answer to my question, which you resisted, is that you have written the big book. And it's, I just want to commend you on the accomplishment. Gayle and I have had the pleasure of being early readers and following you on this journey. And I just want to thank you for what you've given us. It's such an extraordinary accomplishment, and I can't wait until it's out in the world doing the work that we know it's going to be doing. So thank you for allowing us to be sort of fellow travelers with you along the way. It's been wonderful. I know I speak for Gayle.
You are my fellow travelers. This is an ensemblic affair. I think that's one of the topics that we'll maybe want to get into, but you know, trying to get everybody in. And I think we've talked about it, and my dear friend and colleague and interlocutor, Katie Lofton, and I talk about this a lot. I've learned this from jazz studies, from the extraordinary Columbia Jazz Studies group, which has taught me so much. And I'm so appreciative of that community, but the importance of collaboration and also the work of the ensemble that our dear brother Fred, right, has mobilized in terms of our thinking, that it's an ethical practice. And it's certainly something that formalistically I was trying to engage with in the book. And for people in the call, I just want to say I broke into a cold sweat trying to, because sometimes I would panic, like I left people out of the acknowledgements. So Michael Dyson, I don't know if you're on this call, but I'm so sorry, because he was instrumental in helping me reach Marshall Music in Detroit. I think it's possible that somebody is as deeply wound up in my soul as Mark Anthony Neal too. I mean, it's just, I tried to get everybody in. So please know that, because this is the kind of interventionist work that I hope this book is doing as we think about canon formations and undoing those formations to get a different kind of formation. We have great questions. Do we want to roll through any of these or talk about them? I have questions for you guys, and you guys won't let me ask you.
No, you're not allowed. So Gayle, do you want to start, or should I start with Bodies in Dissent? What would you like to do?
Why don't you start, and then I'll jump in.
Okay. So you sort of in some ways addressed this without addressing it, or began to address it. So I actually have a two-part question about Bodies in Dissent, your first book, and its relationship in some ways to this one. Gayle and I were both thinking about that first groundbreaking work, and it sort of came up with a two-part question about it. One is how you see the journey from Bodies in Dissent to this one. If there is a kind of path that opens up into this one. And then also the way that you focus on, in that book, 19th century Black cultural production. And there is the first time I think you insist that we listen to the work of the writer Pauline Hopkins,
Yes,
who is known within American literary studies, as you know, we know her, but less so in music and sound studies. And so she is a figure who appears both in that book and in this one. And you talk about how crucial she is to displace what you call the triple D of kind of Black sound studies, right?
yes.
Gayle reminded us of that, Du Bois, Douglas, and Paul Laurence Dunbar. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between those two, and then how Pauline actually migrates from one into the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think embedded in Bodies in Dissent is a kind of obsession with criticism. And, you know, part of what's happening in this book is semi-autobiographical in terms of paying attention to my own story of my relationship to rock music criticism, being weaned on rock music criticism. As those of us who traveled out to Seattle every year, most of us, at least from a particular generation, now long in the tooth, have that kind of upbringing. And actually really, there is a direct correlation, as I've said to some of my grad students, between the penultimate chapter of Bodies in Dissent and the Experience Music Project, PopCon, that I'll always call it that, the annual Seattle Pop Music Conference. When in 2002, Joshua Clover had curated and convened the first critical karaoke session that featured all sorts of wonderful folks, including Gayle Marcus and Oliver Wang, Ann Powers. See, I'm going to forget people. Jack Halberstam was in the audience. He always reminds me, and got up and did a throwdown on Fleetwood Mac. That was a historic session, as everybody knows, and led to an anniversary session, and people like the fearless Karen Tongson have taken the forum out into the world. But after I did critical karaoke, I came back and I wrote the end of the third chapter. And I just remember a kind of labial, kind of fluid way that I was writing that felt closer, me trying to approximate writing alongside of a performance event years and years and years away from me, in the archive, and trying to imagine the experience of, being in the footlights or, underneath the footlights, looking up at Bert Williams and George Walker. So formalistically and methodologically, I think that there are ties between that book and this book in terms of just thinking about method and writing about performance and our intimacies, as our children like to say, and I say that very respectfully, so I'll say about that, but our intimacies with performance and sound. And I wanted to really honor that through the vantage point of Black women listeners and craftspeople. But specifically with regards to Pauline, and again, I guess there's a bridge here from intimacy to what I'm about to say, is I just want to get close to her. I wanted to actually regard her as a full human being with aesthetic passion and desire, and to try to dissect and ask questions of what it would mean to be a Black feminist, nationalist, unmarried, journalist, novelist, former vocalist, right, who went to the concert hall and then came home and wrote about it, and usually interpolated those kinds of experiences into her fiction, but also wrote about it in her journalism. So to understand and really reckon with what a full intellectual life looks like from the point of Black women's sociocultural experiences, and to mark that point, to plant a flag, as I call it, at the dawn of the so-called modern century. So that's why she's special to me and why I had to start the story with her. And I will say, of my fantastic editor, Sharmila Sen, I don't know if she's on this call, but she has cradled this baby of a book, and I'm so grateful to her. I'm grateful to my editor, Nate Young, who was my prose editor and structural editor as we were kind of trying to sort through this whole thing. I could go on, but Sharmila, also tough love, a lot of great feminist tough love. When we were on the phone, when I was up at the Cornell School of Criticism, whenever that was, 2019, we were on the phone and she was starting to read the project. At that point, she was not my editor. There's a longer story about how I ended up with Sharmila. She was like, yeah, I'm in Pauline Hopkins, but so what? Tell me why. I'm like, oh, we do this to our students all the time. But so again, and I say this to the students on the line, that I'm a sharper and better writer because of the people who've challenged me, and especially the feminists on the line who've challenged me. May we keep challenging each other lovingly. So thank you for that question.
Daphne, I won't try to repeat what Farah said, but I want to say for this whole group, there are 165 or so people tuned in, partly because you walk the talk, and no one is more generous than Daphne Brooks. And I have to say that, we all learn from your example and so many other things, but no one is more generous. So one of the things that is astonishing about this book, including the kind of the vast array of voices that it includes, not just objects of study, but also critical interlocutors. It is so abundant. You have the figure of like juggling, which is usually 3 balls in the air, but you've got like 6 or 8 balls in the air at the same time. And it really is astonishing to engage with on the page. Not only that, but we all know, those of us who have heard you at EMP know about your like richly elusive, playful, beautiful writing. And that's like sustained for page after page after page. It's really a wonderful experience to engage with this book. And the fact that it's so, well, I want to actually maybe get to the question of the big book. I think we do have to go back to that because, but I'm not going to start there because I do think the question of the big book is important because the big book belongs to a certain kind of tradition. And maybe inadvertently, I guess I'm asking the question I wasn't going to ask, but maybe even if that wasn't where you said, I'm going to write the big book, it's significant that this is a big book. So I want to say that, huh?
It's a long book.
Big, and many dimensions, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the title. Liner Notes for the Revolution. The people who maybe have heard various pieces of this book along the way, one of the things is you're not only, this is a multimedia approach to sound and music. So rock criticism, liner notes, other kinds of writing that are musical or kind of music adjacent are all part of this. And so the title alludes to that, but also for the revolution, it alludes to kind of the diverse temporalities, the imagined, the not yet. Can you talk about that as well, liner notes for the revolution, as well as the subtitle, the intellectual life of Black feminist sound? It's a really rich title.
Well, thank you, Gayle, and all of the things that you say about me. Come on, it all goes right back to the both of you. I think the running theme here is going to be the feminists who've pushed me and women who've pushed me. So another person, I don't know if she's on this call, but the great Carol Hall, who is Alicia Hall Moran's mother, Jason Moran's mother-in-law, a towering figure in the editorial world for many years. She told me this book was far from done in the summer of 2019, kind of back to back around the time when Charmlek came into my life. And one of the things that she kept pushing me on was, what's the revolution? What's the revolution? I was like, God, well, it's so kind of, so endemic to my writing and my thinking that actually being challenged to take apart all of the different dimensions of the subversive potentiality of Black women's sonic cultures meant that I was talking about epochs, but I was also talking about strategies of survival. I was talking about a kind of event that might occur in the book itself, that to write the big book, as you all say, I don't call it, but to write a long book that I would say, has all sorts of precedent, and you guys, what Gayle and Farah have done, and the genealogy, the short compressed genealogy that I put up in the PowerPoint, to do that requires thinking broadly and panoramically, right? So I was trying to write laterally, right, and vertically, right, across time and space. And that also is, a lot of my, when I teach undergrad classes and we talk about trying to explain modernity to our students, and I taught back at Princeton, I taught a history of popular music culture class with the great Josh Gild. And I remember the point when we got to talking about modernity, I was trying to give them a sense of, and this comes from Stuart Hall and so many other folk, Fred Hortense, of just what shifts are brought about by, dramatic forces, be it, at the level of the technological, industrial revolution, and how does art both encapsulate those changes, but also instigate those changes. So I'm being a little circuitous here, but these were the kinds of ideas that I had in my head to kind of figure out what it meant for the sisters who are at the very bottom of the socio-historical power structure, all that they can see, and how their art would, necessitate having to encapsulate, all of that terror, all of that transformation, all of that turbulence, and also all of that beauty. Many critics have done that. I wanted to try and do it specifically in relation to Black women in popular music culture. And then the other way that I was thinking about liner notes, and Brent Edwards and Epistrophes has, beautiful meditations on jazz liner notes. John Gennari did too in his work on the form. But I wanted to think formalistically again about this idea of Sedgwickian writing alongside, sonic events and sonic history, to try to experimentally document, these kinds of revolutionary aesthetic changes and possibilities brought about by Black women artists. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. I mean, and I want to just say to people who will read this book that I think it really does change the field, or really blasts apart the field, because suddenly we've only been looking at parts of it, or most of us have only been looking at parts of it, and suddenly what counts really has changed. And I want to say another thing that I think is a major intervention is the way that you break down the binary that's been so, in some ways, central to feminist criticism between marginal and central, or invisible and visible, because you argue that Black women sonic producers are simultaneously kind of everywhere and nowhere, or, kind of cited and disappeared. And I think that intervention is so helpful, and it really changes the way that people can begin to think about these things going forward. I mean, you demonstrate it, but I think it's one of the big takeaways.
Thank you. I mean, and I hope so. And I think that we are really, looking at another generational shift in the field. We've got so many exciting books that are out. Maureen Mann's book, and I see, again, I'm going to forget people, but it's such a moment now to do this kind of work broadly and from a multiplicity of vantage points. We can never have too many books on Nina Simone. So thank you, Salome Shattullett, for working on that, right? We should have many on all of these topics.
I have a follow-up to that in some ways. And that's that, this is a book that is about Black women as musicians and producers of culture. But you also, I think, most originally pay attention to them as listeners, as collectors, as archivists, as critics. And so Gayle and I were wondering if you could talk a little bit about this approach, and how did you arrive at it? And would you consider it a method, actually?
Yeah, thank you, Farah, Jasmine, Griffin, for that question. I think that really emerged, in two ways. One, the book is divided into side A and side B. Thank you, Nate Young. Worked on that with Nate Young as we sorted out what goes in this book and what goes somewhere else. And on side B, we spent a lot of time with a couple of generations of important collectors and thinkers, writers, who were very interested in a very specific thread of blues women's musicking. The Geeshie and Albee story, famously and importantly told by the great Grail Marcus, who has an enormous impact on my thinking and is all over this book. And also John Jeremiah Sullivan and the New York Times Magazine cover story from 2014. I became interested in this phenomenon that some folks refer to as lost blues women. And I wanted to be able to try to answer the question of where these women were, or even if we should be trying to answer that question, thank you, Jack Halberstam, at all. And if we didn't answer that question, we asked different questions of the phenomenon of these women making the music, and where that music went and how it was cared for and looked after. Thank you, Kiara Keeling. Then, what other kinds of stories can we tell? How can we widen the lens of how we talk about Black women in popular music culture? So that sort of led me down this path, a path of thinking much more broadly and panoramically about the story of Black women in popular music culture. And all thanks to my dear, wonderful 94-year-old mother, Juanita Catherine Watson Brooks, who I believe is on this call because she does Zoom, out in Menlo Park, California, when she turned 90 and had this wonderful gala in downtown Palo Alto with a tiara and everything. did the electric slide. This woman is amazing. I was charged with, as all academics and families are, doing the oral history of her life. And we got to the point of talking about her teen years, and she just started dropping all this knowledge about going to record stores with her girlfriends. And I was like, all those years, you and Dad were so hard on me, playing the Police and the Clash too loud in my bedroom. And oh my gosh, and you have stories? So that was important. And I thought, okay, this is a kind of a counter historical way of understanding blues music culture and blues women's culture. And I really, that's the most exciting part of the book to talk to grad students about, because it's just like, here, go do these things. We need you, people. And it filled me with great joy. And then the other sort of inspiration for that was, and this comes from Hazel Carvey, Rosetta Wright's, the great second wave, Upper West Side, Jewish activist, lover of the blues, who in the late 70s was writing a book about menopause and started throwing on the Bessie Smith. And when she went to the record store to try and find more copies of all the classic blues queens, they were out of print. So she used her divorce money and also all sorts of other support in order to start a record label, Rosetta Records, and not only reissued those records, but wrote these just fiery second wave feminist, radical feminist readings of blues music. And if you go to our archive at Duke University, there are 67 boxes of marginalia and notes and just documentation of intellectual labor, which is, to go back to your question, Gayle, the ways that I was originally, the subtitle had something to do with intellectual labor, because I really did want to pay attention to the craft of the way that these women were thinking about and approaching how they wrote about sound, and why it was important to them. So that's how it just kept kind of expanding. The Hansberry and the Ellen Willis story was another archive tale, where I was at the Schlesinger Library during my year at the Radcliffe, and Ellen Willis's papers had just been donated to the library, or acquired by the library, I should say. And in one of the boxes, there's an article she wrote when she was an undergrad at Barnard on interviewing Lorraine Hansberry, who she wanted to hitch her wagon to, as the article was called. And I thought, well, ain't that something? She usually wrote about the Stones. What the devil is going on here? So, then you go to Lorraine Hansberry's archive and you find out how obsessed she is with culture writing and with anti-Blackness in the world of culture writing, and the kinds of interventions that she wanted to make, and who gets to control the reins of the culture writing world. And you have a story about resonances, thanks to the late great Jose Munoz, who helps us to think about the what might be in these archives, and ships passing in the night, but those kinds of even brief shared intimacies can lead to all sorts of questions about the what might be of how we write and think about Black women in popular music culture.
Daph, will you talk more about, maybe this builds off of what you're saying, because you brought in the beautiful part about your mother and about different women's interiority, their desires, their passions, their aesthetics. Can you talk about the kind of more broadly about desire in the book, because it cuts both ways? I mean, and it's animated, I think, beautifully by your own critical desires, but then you're also tracing and kind of responding to histories of desires to, kind of hunt down, locate the desire for art, for origins, the desire for the rare 78 or things like that. So can you talk a little bit more maybe about both sides of desire?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm looking at Weisbart, who's always been my timekeeper for 20 years now. So if we need we need to go to Q&A soon, that's fine. I liken our relationship to Alvin.
Wait, now you're making me talk to you about time?
Where you come in and go, Alvin. Well, okay, here's how I want to answer that question, Gayle. And this gets back to identifications and disidentifications in popular music writing. I on side B, I really wanted to pay attention to what it means for gatekeepers and canon builders, and also important collaborative allies. I really want to stress that Gayle and John have done really important work historically, right? And then there are people in the middle, like John Fahey, who's just, he probably would have been at the Capitol on January 6th, so who are obsessed with blues music, blues women's music in particular, in very problematic ways. But so the ethical gambit that I was both trying to live up to in the book and also question in relation to the figures that I explore in the book is to think about the how and the where and the why that we interpolate ourselves into our criticism and our desires, and how those desires, how important and crucial it is, I think, to put those desires on display in our writing, put ourselves on display, and to recognize the importance of being open to ourselves as objects of inquiry in the stories that we tell about popular music culture. Importantly, because of the intersectionally problematic way that popular music culture has been controlled by men who are white. And so trying to pull back, and more broadly white folks, but trying to pull back the curtain, so to speak, and demand that we think about the entire event, right? That gets you to the point of desiring and liking a particular object, and what you carry into the story that you're telling about that object, is really powerful. And it's probably should be scary, right? It's a little bit dangerous, but I think it's necessary if we're gonna get to the point of having a richer and more heterogeneous way of writing about it, culture at all. But popular music writing in particular has been notoriously troubled with regards to that. I almost told a story from 20 years ago involving people at an EMP panel, but I'm not going to do that. Not going to go deep into that archive. So yeah.
Eric, do you want to open it up to Q&A? We could keep going, but I don't.
It's really Carl who's going to do the Q&A part. I have resigned. No, I'm kidding. No, it's Carl's call. But
we've only got a couple of direct questions in the Q&A at this point, so we can go to it and hope that people pop up again. But if there's stuff you guys want to deal with before that, it's not like we have a big backlog of questions at this point.
Okay.
Well,
where should we go?
Yeah, whichever way we want to go. Should we address those questions or?
Oh, I can, sure, but Farah, if you were going to ask something.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you if you could talk a little bit about, I know you've thought about this. If you could talk a little bit about your audience, not us as members of an audience, and theorizing that position.
Mm-hmm.
But your audience, what are your imagined audiences, desired audiences? To whom are you speaking here?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a beautiful question. Fred made me cry a couple months ago, and I hope it's okay to tell the story, and I don't know if he's on the call, but he said, I wish I could have given this book to my mom. And I was just, whoa. That was important because that was something that I didn't necessarily set out to do, but once it was articulated, I felt the affirmation in my soul and my spirit. We've talked through the years, you and I and Gayle and folks out in the world of EMP about what it means to try to navigate a kind of, or to cultivate a kind of writing that can speak to many publics, right, at once. And the late great Barbara Christian, my mentor from undergrad at Berkeley, famously threw down the gauntlet. I don't like that formulation, but in the Race for Theory, about reminding us of the fact that Black folks have been theorizing since the boat touched the soil. and that there are different ways of coming at that and writing that. So I wanted to write a book that could have meaning and purpose in the academic classroom, that could be taken up in different spaces outside of academia, and that had a language that had a polyvalence to it. Ooh, I guess that's too academic. Right? The heterogeneity. Ooh, no, to speak in many tongues, right, all at once. And I think that I've talked with my grad students about this, that over the years, that's something that I've done and have had different responses to my writing, right? That it's either too academic, right? Or it's not academic enough. And I think the latter feels more like a compliment. But I've been trying to come up with a hybrid prose that approximates the feeling that I got when I could sit in Tower Records on El Camino Real in Los Altos for hours and hours reading Rolling Stone and, I'm sorry, Hit Parade and Cream, and had arguments, with the critics about whatever it is that folks were writing about. And I loved that language because it felt so alive. And I hated that language because it was so combative and ugly and masculine. And so I wanted to both inhabit that prose and explode it. And then I wanted to conjoin it with all the Black feminist pedagogy that constitutes who I am. And if there's an audience out there that is willing to roll across all of those different spaces and voices, then that's who I'm speaking to. Thank you for that question.
That seems like a pretty good time to maybe go to the audience. So we have a question first from Antonia Randolph. If you want to unmute and ask Antonia.
Oh, sure. First of all, thank you so much for this book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. As you're describing the book, it reminded me of Words of Fire by Beverly Guy Sheftall. And I was wondering if that was in your mind at all as you were putting together the book.
No, thank you so much for that. And she's such a force and somebody who, has been collaborating of late with Salamisha Tillett and her wonderful new book on The Color Purple. Yes, that is a book that it conceptually, it wasn't a book that I thought of conceptually until much later as I was working on this project, but I used it as a resource because it includes Lorraine Hansberry's long tract on Simone de Beauvoir. And so it's a wonderful model for thinking about Black feminist intellectual history, as is Farah Griffin and Barbara Savage, and there's another co-editor for the Black feminist intellectual, Mia Bay? Yeah, right. Wonderful anthology on Black feminist intellectual history. What's shocking to me is that we don't have more of these anthologies. We have different kinds of Black feminist critical anthologies that are so important, including the late great Cheryl Wald's Changing Our Own Words was just pivotal for me when I was starting graduate school. But to actually talk at length about the various kinds of Black feminist intellectual history, to think in multiplicities about that kind of a phenomenon is something that's exciting to me. And Words of Fire certainly paved the way for the work that I'm doing. So thank you for that question. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Ian Balfour.
Hey, Ian. Oh, unmute.
Sorry, I think this is maybe too pointed a question, so you can disregard it, but I was wondering if you may have overlooked if you've written something on her, but I was wondering if you had some thoughts on Ronnie Spector, who back in the news, and
Yes.
it seems like your work would enable us to think about her history, and in some ways so extreme and in other ways kind of exemplary. And
Yes, that's it. Thank you. No, thank you for that. I'm going to reference Black Diamond Queens, Morning Man's fantastic new book on Black women in rock. She like early on was writing about the Ronettes and gave this fantastic talk on the Ronettes. They PMP years ago. She doesn't come up in the book. It's an interesting sort of, I talk about this, I talk about the rhizomatic resonances of the book. So there's a little bit of skipping and dialectical play, such that you don't get any kind of core teleological arc to where the book is going, which would encapsulate all of the figures from a particular era. But I actually am really interested in thinking more about the Ronettes. There's a mid-century volume of this project that I'm just in the throes of still shaping. And I've been thinking about them alongside of Etta James and also early Tina Turner. So, thank you for bringing her up. She's the counter narrative to the person who just passed away this week. And that's important. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So we've just got one more question in the chat. So if people are having
people want to go to supper, Carl.
I know, but if people have things coming to mind, we probably have time for a couple more after this, but I'll ask Danielle Bainbridge to step in now.
Aw, Professor Bainbridge.
Hey. So I was really drawn to, it took me a while to even type it out, so I might just read it, but I was really drawn to what you were saying about the connections between desire and intimacy in the writing of this book, especially around the writing related to your mother. And as you know, in my own work on Black women's public performance, I'm always really interested in distinctions between the private, the public, and the intimate spheres of how we deal with these texts. So I was wondering if in this autobiographical writing, you found that you were negotiating this with your own desire of what you chose to keep private, what made you feel intimacy with these creators, and also what you chose to make public in the work and how those decisions were getting made. And also just hi. I miss you.
Hi, Professor Bainbridge. As usual, the dense and robust interrogation from Professor Bainbridge. That's amazing. Let me try to piece this out a little. Actually, wow, maybe I'll go to the heart of the danger in the book. So in terms of intimacies, side B is also kind of mapping my relationship to some of the critics who are collectors. And they are important relationships and debates, intellectual debates that are being had across emails and questioning of sources and archives, et cetera, et cetera. And so I will just say very candidly that I had to figure out why, and Farah and Gayle both asked me this several times, why it was important to me to keep the email exchanges between a particular interlocutor. And I felt like it was important because it went to the heart of trying to lay bare the labor that we do as researchers, as I'm not going to call myself an ethnographer, but as thinkers who are piecing together narratives that involve an ensemblic array of figures who can assist you with your work, who can block your ability to do your work if they want, who have feelings about your work, right? And I felt like I was kind of trying to tell an inside out story of who we are as critics. And so that was something I was committed to doing. And I do want to thank the person. I'm not going to name that person, but he knows who he is, there were two people, and Gayle was incredible, and thank you for all the help in writing about Gishin Elvey. And there's another person who I had a very interesting professional set of exchanges about Gishin Elvey, and I appreciate his allowing me to share our exchanges in the book. Got to read the book to find out what it is. And what was the other piece of the fantastic Danielle Bainbridge question?
It was just sort of the heart of what you've chosen to, in your own personal writing, remain private, and then what kind of draws you to feel these intimacies with these Black women creators.
Yeah, right. If I'm going to write about the whole lives or the wider and deeper lives of these artists, both out on stage and, keeping diaries and journals like Abby Lincoln did, or, who are rehearsing different ways of trying to craft their prose like Rosetta Wrights did. it seemed important to me ethically to share what I could about my own thought process as well. So that was kind of my strategy for trying to live up to and parallel and write alongside of and write the liner notes to this history, was to, again, interpolate myself into the narrative and do that with some kind of intellectual humility, I hope. So that was really important to me. And with Mom, I will say the great Juanita Brooks, and also the late great Lodell Matthews, my aunt, who there's a photo of her affixed to it's the opening of the book. She's standing out on a at the Grand Canyon with one of her employers. She worked as a domestic for UC Berkeley families and became a deep intellectual interlocutor to these families. I wanted to just to widen the sphere of who gets counted in what we call, intellectual life and the work that these women do. So thank you, Danielle, for that question.
And now things are popping up all of a sudden. We have another question from Patrick Johnson.
Oh, Patrick Johnson. This is like the last episode of Lost, y'all, except that would mean we're dead. So,
congratulations, love. I've seen so many iterations of this book, and I'm glad that you're finally giving birth to it, and such a gift to us all. So, I have a question about methodology, because it's one that I've been in conversation with a number of folks of our generation about, and what's interesting to me is how many of us are moving to, John Jackson doesn't claim this, he said he got it from his students, but I've co-opted it as well, multimodal methods.
John, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But how we're all moving toward these forms that are not traditionally academic. But it's hard, when you have a research question that you want to answer but present it through, music or a film or some other thing. So can you talk a little bit about your methodology for this book in particular? Because it's not just literary analysis, it's not just sound studies, it's a combination of multi-methods.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Johnson. I appreciate that. For me, it started with problem solving, which we try to encourage all of our interdisciplinary students to think about the question that can't be answered through a single, line of methodology, right? So that's what Black studies has taught me, and Black feminist studies has taught me. But very specifically in relation to how this book started to really take shape, was to start to try to trace the trajectory of cultural objects that matter in the story that I was telling. So for instance, the records we have for the lost blues women, but we don't have the women anymore, right? But we have these records that have scratches in them. Who made the scratches? Who owned those records, right? How did they care for them? Look after them, pace, care, healing, right? And I kept just kind of trying to push that line a little bit. And we know not only for the great and majestic Dr. Hartman, but all the way back to the great and majestic Toni Morrison, Queen Toni, that that speculative recourse enables us to engage in different lines of inquiry. We can't all write like Dr. Hartman, and we should not try. Right? we should, and also Professor Griffin, who's Tutu Girls and Harlem Nocturne, was, really is a paradigmatic kind of example of lingering on an archival opacity, as we sometimes call it, or conundrum. Who were these women? And what would it mean to try to know something more about them, or to ask the reasons why they're not there? To lead with those kinds of questions then demands that you try to move improvisationally through a variety of methods. And that is literally how this book kind of unfolded. Like, it was just like, I've run into a problem, and what is the creative way that I can respond to that problem and honor that problem too, and turn the problem into an object of inquiry. So thank you, Professor Johnson.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. And first up is David Grubbs.
Thanks. And Daphne, thanks for this fantastic talk and for the conversation. My question, I guess, reflects my own kind of excitement and impatience to look at the scope of the book. And I was struck by the formulation Black feminist sound in the subtitle. And I just wanted to, I think maybe this comes from a similar impulse to Patrick's question, but I want to hear about the relation of sound and music, right? And the object of study.
Thank you for that. Because of the panoramic arc of the book, I did believe that sound would allow us to encapsulate something far more atmospheric, environmental, phenomenological, but not in the conventional theoretical ways in which we define phenomenology, that it could approximate the experience of the ways that the sonic is so fundamental to Black life and Black women's lives from a variety of different vantage points. And I really, like, a touchstone for this, of course, is Christopher Small's musicking as well. So I originally, it had been sounds, and again, hats off to Sharmila Sen, who was like, I really think it's, I'm doing what Sharmila, I don't know if she's on this call, it's really more sound, I think it's something that, now I'm paraphrasing her, but capaciousness, it has a capaciousness to it. So that was the vision behind that. At the same time, shout out to my amazing interlocutor, Alexandra Vasquez, who has done beautiful work in documenting the ways in which identifying sound studies, Gus Stadler has done this as well, identifying sound studies as a phenomenon that has sometimes roots in trying to mark itself as distinct from popular music studies, which is, for the people, by the people, highbrow, lowbrow, that kind of tension. So I didn't want to lean into that, but I did want to try to mark the fact that this is a tale that is voluminous in size and space and across time. So thank you for that question.
Great, thanks very much.
And finally, we've got one from Lisa B. Thompson, if she could unmute and ask.
Lisa B. Thompson. Lisa, are you out there?
Is Lisa still here?
I see Sonnet. Sonnet could be Lisa. One of my fantastic and amazing interlocutors whom I adore, Sonnet Redmond.
Well, maybe I'll just read hers, which asks what advice you have for Black women artists making decisions about where to place their archives and what to place in them.
Drop the mic. Well, this is a plug for the Pembroke Center at Brown. The great Anne Ducille, right, is leading an effort along with her colleagues there to put together and identify and acquire Black feminist academics archives. So that's just an amazing effort. I also think, and this is probably, it's a funny place to end, but let's send it out into the world and let's continue thinking about it. One of the arguments that I make is that we need to pay attention to, Elizabeth Alexander's talked about this too recently, what's in a sister's trunk or in her closet, right? And we need to be able to protect those materials, look after them. Thank you, Kara. And maybe be wary at the same time of institutions and how certain institutions do or don't care for Black women's intellectual life. So maybe we need to be doing more institution building and also challenging, right, the terms by which we define what an institution is and how it operates in communities. Jackie Stewart, my other great interlocutor, doing all that work with the Home Movies Project in Chicago is a great example of that. So here's to more informal archives. And that's Setkovich as well has shown us that, you know, we need to be doing that for the sister musicians in particular. This was so fun. Don't people want to eat dinner? Eric Weisberg?
Yeah, no, we're happy to close down.
Look at all these.
Wait, should I
Yeah.
pause the recording on Daphne saying, when can I eat dinner?
Leave it in.
I just want to thank Daphne and Farah and Gayle for an amazing session. And everybody who